evidence in human beings. Okay, so now we have randomized controlled trials. Now, experimental studies, they usually involve some action, an intervention, or manipulation in the experimental group. The control group, either it receives no change or it gets an alternative intervention. So either you're giving them a placebo or you give them the standard treatment. And then what is done in experimental epidemiology is you observe the two groups and then you compare the outcomes. Okay, so experimental epidemiology is equivalent to testing treatments, okay, so that we can bring out better evidence for healthcare. So the aims are to provide scientific proof for causative or risk factors and to measure effectiveness and efficiency of a health service. Okay, so it can be related to just, you're looking at vaccines, you're looking at individual drugs, you can looking at chemoprophylaxis. Okay, you can also look whether a particular exposure is associated, for example, air pollution. Okay, is it related with myocardial infarction? Okay, so on a very polluted day, does it mean when people are exposed to very polluted air, does it increase the amount of heart attack? That is the research which is being carried out now. Okay, so you can provide proof for causative or risk factors. You can also measure effectiveness of treatment, therapies, as well as for health services. And on a larger scale, you can even evaluate health programs. For example, we have a large immunization program. Whether our immunization is actually reducing the number of childhood illnesses is another thing that we can measure and study. Now, what is the problem with experimental epidemiology? The thing with carrying out experiments is that they are expensive. So the cost can be a factor which can stop us from carrying out further experiments. The other very important factor is that the ethical reasons. When we carry out experiments on human beings, we have to be very careful how we select the population and also whether such studies are feasible or not. Okay, so therefore it is very important that we get a clearance from the ethical committee wherever we are placed in order to carry out experiments to provide further knowledge about certain issues. Now, animal studies, they have contributed to our knowledge of anatomy, physiology, pathology, okay, all your basic sciences, immunology, microbiology, genetics, okay, all of this. Okay, so how have animal studies contributed? You can reproduce human disease in animals so that we can confirm etiology, you can confirm mechanism, you can confirm pathogenesis. We can also test efficacy of preventive or therapeutic drugs or vaccines, and we can also study the natural history of disease. Now, the advantage of having animals as study subjects is that animals can be bred in laboratory and manipulation is very easy. So you must be seeing in pharmacology, you see the white mice because they breed very quickly. Okay, they multiply quickly and therefore the investigator can carry out experiments, especially for your genetic studies. But there are limitations because not all diseases of human beings can be reproduced in animals. For example, for a long period of time, leprosy, the leprosy bacilli were very difficult, leprae bacilli, it was very difficult to grow them in animals. And therefore, we were not able to get much breakthroughs. Okay, it was only later that the 9-banded armadillo was found and then we could carry out studies. Okay, so all diseases cannot be reproduced. Another thing is that not always, okay, you may get a vaccine. For example, we had the typhoid vaccine. The kill typhoid vaccine, which was the phenol inactivated one, was found to be very effective in rats. But when the same study was replicated in human beings, it was not as effective. So something being effective in animals does not always translate to it being effective among human beings. Okay, so we can have limitations for the conclusions that we can draw from animal studies. Okay, so therefore human experiments are very important in order to investigate etiology. Whenever we want to evaluate preventive and therapeutic measures, it is important that we carry out human. Now, because these are human experiments, these have to be very highly regulated. Now, the two main types of human experiments that can be carried out are the randomized controlled trials and you can have non-randomized controlled trials. So some examples of human experiments. You have James Lind carrying out his scurvy research, then Edward Jenner working on smallpox, and finally having the pox vaccine, which was effective against smallpox. Okay, all because he heard a milkmaid say, "Oh, I will not get smallpox because I've already had cowpox." Okay. Then again, you had Finlay and Reed who worked on the yellow fever etiology as well as vaccine production, and Goldberger who demonstrated his studies on pellagra, especially the pellagragenic action of corn. Okay. Now it's very important that whenever we carry out human experiments, that we should weigh the benefit should be weighed against the risk. It's very important that the volunteers who are part of your experiment should be made aware that they are taking part in an experiment. And as far as possible, fatal experiments should be avoided. So there is a very strict code of practice which is laid down by the WHO, which needs to be followed whenever we carry out human experiments. Now let us look at the randomized controlled trial. So the randomized control trial, or an RCT as I will be referring to it in the next part of the lecture, is the gold standard for evaluating efficacy of therapy, preventive measures, and other public health measures. So both in clinical medicine as well as in public health, the RCT is the gold standard. Okay. And today when you look at the level of evidence at the top of your pyramid, we have what is known as a systematic review of RCTs. That will be at the top of the pile, followed by well-conducted RCTs. And then you have the cohort studies and then the case control studies coming below. Okay, so at the top of the pile, you have a systematic review of RCTs, but RCT is the gold standard for evaluating any therapy, any drug, any vaccine, any intervention that is carried out in human beings has to be evaluated by an RCT. So subjects in an observational study, they are recruited on the basis of their exposure status. Okay, so you look for exposure. You take people who either consume alcohol and those who don't consume alcohol. Okay, in an RCT, the investigator allocates the intervention. Okay, and because you're allocating the intervention, the investigator is controlling the exposure, and therefore it is known as a randomized controlled trial. Okay, so therefore the word controlled means that the exposure to the intervention is being controlled by the investigator. Okay. Now what is the first word? Randomization. That is the heart of the RCT. The randomized basis for the allocation into experimental and study group. So when you have a group of people and you want to assess the efficacy of a drug, now which person from this group do you put into the study group and which person do you put into the control group? And therefore the investigator's bias should not come. For example, if a doctor is carrying out the study, he may put the most severe cases to allocate for the new treatment and the less ones for the standard therapy or the placebo group. Okay, so we don't want bias. Every person should have an equal chance to be selected into the experimental or study group. Therefore, we have to carry out a randomized allocation into study and experimental group. Okay, and therefore this study is called as a randomized controlled trial. Okay, and it's important that you remember what each of these words mean. Now, why should we carry out an RCT? Okay, you have observational studies. So you have case series. So in case series, you take a group of people who have the disease. For example, you want to learn about diabetes, you take a group of people about diabetes and you study them, you look at their features, you look at their age, you look at the BMI, okay, you look at family history, you look at physical activity levels and you see, okay, what is happening? So you're studying persons with the disease. Then when you look at case control studies, you take persons who have diabetes and you take persons who don't have diabetes. And then you look how many of these people were actually exposed. How many of them, for them, it was actually because of family history. How many of them because they were smoking or because they consumed alcohol. Why did they develop diabetes? So if you want to bring out an association between an exposure and the disease, you carry out case control studies. Then Going one step forward, when you have sufficient evidence for a particular association between exposure and disease, you can go ahead and then carry out a cohort study. Now, what a cohort study does is, because it follows a group of people who have been exposed, so you start with the exposure and you follow them up over a period of time, you can establish the temporality of association. That means you know that the cause has come first and then the effect. Okay, so you can establish a temporal association between exposure and the disease. Okay, so this is typically what came first, the chicken or the egg. Okay, to answer that question. Okay, then we need to carry out clinical trials to establish causality of association between exposure and disease or health conditions as well as treatment. Okay, how can we say a particular thing? Okay, all the persons who manufacture tobacco, they would like to fight and say, why do you say that tobacco is the one that is causing that disease? It can be so many other things. It can be air pollution. It may not necessarily be tobacco. So we have to produce evidence that this particular agent is what is causing the disease. And therefore, in the next class, we will look at what are how criteria for judging causality. How can we say that a particular thing is the cause of a disease? Give fexofenadine. So you compare two different drugs. Okay, or you may give a combination to one group and you may give a single drug to one group. Okay, so you may compare two groups who are receiving two different therapies. Although at times a new treatment may be compared with no treatment, often a decision is made not to use an untreated group. Okay, so because of ethical concerns, we don't want to have one group of people who have a condition who are not given the treatment. Okay, so that is unethical. For example, suppose we want to test, okay, a new therapy for AIDS. Okay, so will we be willing to have a group of persons with AIDS in our group who are not treated? Okay, it's ethical issues. Okay, it may be that some may argue that the CD4 count is higher and so these people don't need treatment. Okay, so you will have to answer the ethical committee group on whether if you have a group, you're not giving a treatment, how do you justify not giving a group of patients the treatment? Okay, so what we normally do is we compare the newly developed therapy with a currently recommended regimen, okay, rather than no therapy at all. So you can compare between two different therapies. So you select the suitable population, which is your reference or target population. You select the suitable population. From them, you draw the study or the experimental population. Then you apply, you have inclusion criteria, your exclusion criteria. You say, I want to include adults. Okay, I will exclude pregnant women. Okay, I will exclude people who have other comorbidities. So you have criteria which you will apply in order to have people in your study. Once you have got the people whom you want in your study, then you use a statistical procedure to see that you have people in an experimental group and in your control group, apply the manipulation, and then you follow up and do assessment. So I really encourage all of you to note this figure down, because if you write this when we ask you about an RCT, then we know that you have understood how it flows, how an RCT flows. Okay, so what is this protocol? I said whenever you want to begin with experimental epidemiology, you start with writing a protocol. Okay, so a protocol is a document that has details of the aims and objectives of your study, how you're going to select your study and control groups, what are the procedures for allocation. So how are you going to do? Are you going to put envelopes? How are you going to generate the numbers? How do you know? How are you going to allocate these persons into the study and the control group? What is the treatment that you're going to apply? You have to specify what you're going to give, okay, to the people, and it has to be the same. So what is the treatment that you're going to give? What are you going to give the control group? What are you going to give the study group? How are you going to keep it? How are you going to keep them? Okay, well, how are you going to standardize your work procedure? And for people who are involved in the trial, who are the parties? Okay, because very often you have pharmaceutical companies, because they are the ones who are producing the drugs and the vaccines. Okay, so they are accountable. They normally give this to another party. They normally recruit doctors to carry out studies. Okay, how are you going to recruit your participants? What is the responsibility if something happens in your trial? Okay, adverse effect, how are you going to deal with it? Okay, and how are you going to evaluate your end result? Okay, all of that is mentioned in this protocol. Now, it is very important to have this protocol because especially if you have many centers that are participating in your study, a protocol will see that everyone is following a standard procedure rather than everyone doing what they want to do at the different centers. So when you have a protocol, you're standardizing everything that you're doing. You're allocating responsibility. What is the responsibility of the researcher? What is the responsibility of the pharmaceutical company? What is the responsibility of the investigators? Okay. And they also have people who will evaluate your results. Now, often we don't want, because pharmaceuticals spend a lot of money in producing their drugs and their vaccines. So often they want results to be skewed in their favor. So persons who are conducting the trial should be independent. Okay, they should not be influenced by the people producing and the ones who have the money. So you have to have very clear procedures in how you're going to evaluate the results. Okay, so that is very important. Now, when you have this protocol, what happens is that it prevents bias and other sources of error. Now, usually before you want to do a protocol, you will do a preliminary test run, what we call as a pilot study. So this pilot study will help you to assess feasibility, acceptability, you will understand flaws, and then you can develop your final protocol. Now, how do we select the study population? So when we talk about the reference population, we are talking the population to which the findings of your study will be applied, okay? Like human beings, particular age, gender, occupation. For example, now the question that is being asked, we have many vaccines now available for coronavirus. Okay, so we have the Covishield vaccine, we have the Covax vaccine, you have the Sputnik vaccine, you have the Pfizer one, there is the BioNTech one. Okay, so you have some which are mRNA vaccines, you have killed coronavirus vaccines, and we also have viral vector vaccines. Now, most of these vaccines have been tried in young, healthy population. Okay, and therefore now the question is being asked, can these vaccines which have been effected in a young, healthy population, can they be given to the older population? Can they be given to those with comorbidities? Can we give it to those who are not in this? Okay, so reference population is whatever study you carry out, okay, they can be applied to whom? Okay, so the population to which the finding of the study will be applied. So ideally, if these vaccines be tried in a particular age group, the efficacy and the effectiveness of this vaccine is most applicable for that particular age group. Okay, and therefore a lot of questions which are being asked by countries and by organizations which are rolling out the vaccination program. Okay. Now, the experimental population, these are participants who are derived from the reference population. Okay, and these should be derived by a random method and they should fulfill some criteria. What is the criteria? Experimental, they should give informed consent. They should know that they're being invited to participate in an experimental study and what are the benefits of this treatment, what are the risks, what are the adverse effects of this treatment should all be explained to them. Once those things have been explained, when they sign, then that will be called as informed consent. So this population, they should be representative of your reference population. They should be eligible. Okay, they should be able to participate in a study and they should be from a stable population. You don't want people you recruit in your study and then they suddenly leave your area and go and you're left with a depleted population. Okay, so ideally you should tell them, will you be available to be a part of this study over the next 1 year or 2 years? Okay, so only then will you recruit them into the study. So after we have selected our study population and the reference population, now we carry out randomization. So the randomization is the heart of a control trial. Okay, so this is a statistical procedure by which participants are allocated into the study and the control groups. We do this to reduce bias and to allow comparability between your study and the control group. Now, every individual gets an equal chance of being allocated into either group. Now, how do we do this randomization? Okay, we use a table of random numbers and also you can also use a computer to generate random numbers. Now, this is what a table of random numbers looks. Okay, so these are random numbers. As you can see, these numbers are distributed. They're all different numbers. So what you do is how do you use this table, or how do you use it to allocate patients for treatment groups? If we plan to compare two groups, you can decide that even digits, so all the even digits in these numbers, okay, they designate treatment A, and odd digits designate treatment B. So you can put all the numbers together, and on the day when you're carrying out, okay, so when you invite the patients, you give the persons who are in your study, you give them numbers, okay, and that numbers are allocated. So all the ones who get even digits will go into treatment A, and those who get odd digits will go into treatment B. Okay. Now, if you don't like that way of doing, then you can decide that digits 0 to 4 will determine treatment A, and 5 to 9 will designate treatment B. Okay. So there are different ways in which you can allocate people for that particular treatment. Okay, you can put all of these in envelopes and ask people to draw one of the investigators, so that there is no bias, you just pull it out. Okay, so that's why it's called at random. Okay, so it's randomly decided. Then if you have three groups, you can decide that digits 1 to 3 is treatment A, 4 to 6 is B, 7 to 9 is C, and digit 0 will be ignored. Okay, so that way you decide how those numbers, so you're not looking at people, but you're looking at the numbers. Okay, so that the personal bias of the investigator is reduced. Now, why is this important? Because there has been a very large study which was carried out for women's health. This was the women's health study, and this was to study the effect of, estrogen therapy in postmenopausal women. Okay, so estrogen therapy for women who are in the, having menopause, and because of, the effects of menopause, you get flushing, okay, and they feel very disturbed, and there's weight gain. So whether we should give women who are had menopause, whether they should be given estrogen therapy to overcome these side effects of menopause. Okay, so when they did that study, what the doctors did was they took all the patients who listened to them and they put them in the study group, and all those who did not listen, were not very good, and they put them in the control group. So there was a big bias in this study. Okay, and today we know that with estrogen replacement therapy, that there are other effects, and therefore it is not always recommended. You have to choose the women very carefully when you want to recommend estrogen replacement therapy, because in practice, in reality, when this study was carried out, the doctors had a lot of bias in whom, and they decided whom to put into which group. Okay, so they put all the good patients, all the ones who followed their thing and followed their instructions into the study group, and all the ones who did not listen to them into the control group. Okay, so most of the differences in the study was rather because of the patient characteristics rather than because of the treatment. Okay, now this is just to help you to understand. Okay, now on this side, on one side we have a non-randomized study, on the other side we have a randomized study. Okay, so why am I saying that a randomized study is good? So in both the studies you have 2,000 people. Okay, out of these 2,000 people, say that we are looking at, our final outcome is we want to look at case fatality. Okay, what is the number of people who are dying? Okay, so when they receive a particular drug, so let's say that these are persons who have had myocardial infarction. Okay, they have had heart attack. Now, those who have heart attacks, some of them can have arrhythmias and some don't have arrhythmias. Okay, so the group who has arrhythmias is colored pink, and those who don't have arrhythmias is the lighter color. Okay, so as you can see, out of 2,000 people, 700 people have arrhythmias. Now, when we assign people when we randomly allocate people to the intervention and no intervention group, what happens is that these 700 people who have arrhythmias, which is like your confounding factor and it can affect their outcome, that gets distributed equally in your groups. Okay, so this is something that always happens. If you do a randomized study, your confounding factor, your factor which will confound your results and mix up or muddle, or you can either overestimate or underestimate the effect of your drug, it will get distributed equally. Now we can have known factors and we can have unknown factors. When you carry out randomization, whatever factors are there, everything gets distributed randomly. That is the beauty of a randomization. Whatever is confounding will get distributed equally between the control and the study group. Okay, so you can see here persons with arrhythmia get distributed equally, both 350 in each group. Okay, Now, if we don't do randomization, look at the way it gets effect. Okay, so they will get distributed unequally. Okay, so either intervention will get group less, or the non-intervention group will get more. Okay, now look at the effect. Now look at the non-randomized study. Okay, so because this effect has got distributed unequally, look at the deaths. Okay, you can see that the deaths which are occurring in this group, okay, was 80. Okay, and here you have 50 deaths. Okay, now look at the case fatality rate. Total number of deaths which were occurring 180. Total number of deaths which are occurring in the non-interventional group are 300. Okay, now as you can see, what has happened here, because you have more cases of arrhythmia in the non-interventional group, the death rate is higher because of the arrhythmia. But you will conclude that because of your intervention, you have lesser case fatality in the interventional group and a higher case fatality in the non-interventional group. When if you had actually done this study in a randomized manner based on random assignment, look, you will get the actual effect. Because your confounding factor is distributed equally, you will get the true estimate of the effect. And now you can see case fatality is almost same. That means the drug per se has not had any effect on the case fatality. Okay, and therefore, in order to estimate the true effect of any intervention or any vaccine, it is always better to carry out a randomized controlled trial, because randomization will see that your confounding variables are distributed equally in both the groups. So after you have carried out randomization, then you carry out the manipulation. It could deliberate application, withdrawal. If people are smoking, you can tell that group to stop smoking. Okay, you can give them a particular drug. You can expose them, okay, to particularly like the babies for which for RLF, okay, for oxygen. Okay, so whatever, whether the drug, vaccine, procedure, diet, whatever, you can carry out the manipulation and you have to write it in detail. For example, if persons with diabetes, whether you're offering them a low carbohydrate diet, whether you're offering them intermittent fasting, and the other group you just tell them to do normal, or you're asking them to carry out intense physical activity of at least 1 hour per day, or you give them therapeutic diet, whatever you do, you want to assess, you have to write it in detail what you're going to apply, okay, whatever manipulation or intervention you're going to carry out. Then both the groups, the experimental as control group, should be followed up with equal intensity. Okay, now what will happen is, because you know you're not and you're more interested in knowing, the company may be more interested in knowing the effect of its drug or vaccine. So don't focus only on the study group. You have to study both the control and the experimental group. And you have to see that you reduce attrition, people leaving your group. You should try to keep as many as people as you enrolled in your study over a period of your study. Okay, so follow-up is also very important because this is a longitudinal study. Then we have to assess the outcomes. So how do you assess the outcomes? Okay, pharmaceutical companies would only like to highlight the positive results, but always you have to have benefits as well as risk. So you have to report positive result as well as negative result. Okay, positive result will be reduction in death. Okay, better quality of life. Negative results would be adverse effects, severe reactions, and death. Okay, so bias can occur in the study, subjective, objective. You have to report what biases were there. Then you can calculate all the risk. Okay, because this is a longitudinal study, so you can calculate relative risk. You can get what is the rate of occurrence of disease. You can calculate attributable risk reduction. For especially for cancer studies, what they look at is survival rate, okay, survival analysis. Okay, so when patients with cancer were given the particular treatment, okay, for example, women with breast cancer, mastectomy, what is the survival rate? At the end of 5 years, how many women are still alive at the end of 10 years? Okay, survival rate. So survival analysis is especially carried out for cancer. Okay, that if you remember, this is more for our MD students, intention to treat and on-randomized. Okay, so basically you have to look at the positive results, negative results, and you can calculate all the risk measures. Now, one important thing, masking or blinding. Okay, why is that important? To reduce the subjective bias, you know. So single blinding is that the persons do not know which group or treatment they are in. So if you're offering a therapy or treatment, so for people, even if you have a placebo, you give them also pills. If you're giving an injection or a vaccine, you give the control group also an injection. Okay, so it may be just a multivitamin injection. Okay, so you give the thing. They should not know that they're in the whether they're in the control group or the study group. So that is single. Okay, and for that you have to take their consent. Okay, that they will not be aware of their status of exposure. Okay, that is single blinding. That whoever the participants, they don't know. Double blinding is whoever is the investigator, the researcher, as well as the participants, they don't know which is which group. Okay, you don't know which group is the study group, and this is good because then you will follow up both groups properly, because that will reduce that observer bias. The triple blinding is where the participant, researcher, and even the person who's evaluating your results, okay, they don't know which is which group, so that they can carry out analysis also in an unbiased manner. Okay, so blinding is done in order to reduce bias and to improve the quality of the study results. Okay, so that is important. Okay, so in a study, in your study design, whenever RCTs they have to indicate what kind of blinding was done. Is it an open label? Open label study means that there was no blinding done. Okay, that means it carries a bias. Whether it was single blinded, most commonly studies are double blinded. It would be ideal to have a triple blinding. Now you will come across some names which are also seen in when you carry out experimental studies. For example, you will see the word called as a field trial. So a field trial is also a trial in which you're carrying out an experiment, but here the unit of the study, they are healthy individuals. Okay, therefore they call as field trials, and usually we carry it out in the community. And field trials have been carried out for polio vaccine, for leprosy vaccine, okay, to look at the efficacy vaccine. Now this is usually undertaken in respect of a preventive procedure, normally something that you want to do, a vaccine or a serum or chemoprophylaxis, personal protective measures, okay, looking at long-lasting insecticide-treated nets, things like that, okay, chemoprophylaxis for malaria, for people who are going to visit. So all of these, when we are looking at preventive prophylaxis, then and it is carried out in healthy persons, then that is referred to as a field trial. So the trial of injectable polio vaccine is possibly the largest human experiment ever conducted. Over 1 million children who are apparently healthy living in the community were randomly divided and offered either the vaccine or the placebo. The trial finally provided strong evidence of the efficacy of injectable polio vaccine. Okay, so children were given, healthy children were taken, and they were offered vaccine or placebo, and that was done. It was a randomized trial, and this gave really good evidence for the efficacy of the killed injectable polio vaccine. Another word that you will hear is a community intervention trial. So this is a trial which seeks to study whether providing fluoridated water supply is effective in reducing occurrence of dental caries. Okay, so in such a setting, we will randomize at the level of communities or clusters of humans. Okay, so whenever you look at clusters and you're doing randomization at the level of community, that is called as a community intervention trial. Okay, so what is done is a few villages are allocated randomly to receive fluoridated water supply, and a few others get ordinary, and then you see whether it has any effect on the incidence of caries. So there are types of experimental studies. For the first one is a clinical trial. So clinical trials are the word which is used whenever you want to evaluate therapeutic agents. You want to look at beta blockers, whether they reduce cardiovascular mortality in patients after they have had a myocardial infarction. In fact, today beta blockers are reserved for persons after they have developed a myocardial infarction, okay, because of evidence that has come from such studies. Okay, so if you want to look at therapeutics, so you're giving it to patients, so then you use the word clinical trials. So in clinical trials, your subjects are persons who have had the disease. Okay, so that's called as clinical trials. Then you have the word, another word which is called as preventive trials. Okay, similar to your field trials. Okay, field trials occur in the field. Community trials happen at the level of the community, but preventive trials, your vaccine trials, they go through all the phases. Okay, vaccine. So because you're using preventive agents, so vaccine and chemoprophylactic drugs. So here they should very clearly state what is the benefit to the community, what is the cost to the health services, and what is the risk involved. Okay, so these are preventive trials. You can also have risk factor trials. Okay, these are also a type of preventive trials. One of the most famous risk factor trial was the MRFIT trial, which is the multiple risk factor intervention trial. Another is the Oslo study. Then you also have the Stanford 3 community trial. So 3 different communities where they tried to see whether a particular risk factor which is known, if we change that risk factor, will it be protective? Okay, for example, if we ask people to consume a healthy diet, to exercise regularly, whether it's going to reduce cardiovascular disease or not. Okay, so this was a risk factor trial. Then you can also have a cessation experiment. Okay, so these are just the different types of interventions that you can have and the experiments or the manipulation that you can carry out. Okay, so cessation experiment is termination or removal of a factor. Okay, so if you tell the person to stop smoking, that is a cessation experiment. So if you have a group of people who continue smoking and a group of people who stop smoking, and then you follow them up and you can show that the incidence of death is lesser among those, or cancer is lesser among those who have stopped smoking, or is there no difference and people can continue smoking for however long they want. Okay, so that's a cessation experiment. So that is very strong evidence for causation. Okay, so if they stop doing something and there is a benefit with it, then we can say that that benefit is because of the reduction or the removal of that factor. So it gives you stronger evidence for causation. So instead of having to tell people or exposing them to a certain noxious agent, it's better to carry a cessation experiment so that ethically it is better. Okay, then you can also have trial of causative agents. Okay, so you expose some to oxygen and you don't expose to some, and then see whether there are any harms of that oxygen therapy or not. Now, this particular philosophy and principles can be applied to evaluate health services as well. And we know that one of the uses of epidemiology is to evaluate health services. So you can assess effectiveness and efficiency of health services. For example, you can see like we have a lot of traditional birth attendants, okay, in our community. Instead of excluding them from the thing, we take these traditional birth attendants and you train them. Okay, so they become, instead of just traditional birth, they become now trained DIs. Okay, and they are the ones you can see whether they will help to reduce maternal mortality. Okay, because they are trained, and in some event when you have women, despite all access, if they're not able to access health institutions and they have to have home deliveries, can the use of trained DIs reduce the maternal mortality, okay, among things. So this is in the way in which we can see how our chemotherapy, whether using female community health volunteers, training the people who are in the way, can improve the efficiency of our health services. Okay. So that was about the different types of interventions that you can have, manipulations that you can do in an RCT. Now, how we are looking at a design of the RCT. Okay, so in a design of an RCT, you can have a parallel design where you allocate people into your therapy and control groups, and then they remain in the same group. And what you do is you compare responses between these two groups. So this is called as a parallel design because they do not mix. Once you randomize them, each of them stay in their own group. So this is called as a parallel design RCT. Okay. Then the next what you can have is, to overcome ethical reasons, you can have a crossover design. Now, what do I mean by a crossover? In a crossover, typically what happens is once you randomize them into therapy and to control, you give this group therapy, you assess their response. You give this group is control, placebo, it could be standard, whatever you're doing, you assess the response. Then what you do is you wait for some period, you allow the drug or that vaccine to wash out. Once you had a washout period, then you switch. What happens is you give this control group, you give them therapy, and the therapy group, you give them control. So what has happened is they're acting as their own controls. Okay, so what you have to assess is response, is you assess response between these groups. You respond when you give therapy first, and then when you give them control, what is the response? You can compare response within this group. Okay, so this is called as a crossover. Now, one of the advantage of this design of doing it, it gets help to get over the ethics. Okay, so some ethical group can say, how can you give the newer group if the newer drug is known to have better efficacy and you're offering it only to one group and you're not offering it to the other group? Okay, so it's not ethical. So what you do is you do this crossover. So initially you keep them in control and then you give them therapy. Here you start with therapy and you make control. Okay, so you can overcome the ethical concerns here and you assess response from within these groups. Okay, so that is a crossover design randomized controlled trial. Then sometimes RCT may not be possible, either because of ethics, because of the cost, because of logistic reasons. Sometimes you how will you induce? You must have heard during COVID that they will expose some healthy individuals to the coronavirus. Okay, induction of disease. So there were a lot of hue and cry. Okay, how can you expose people to the corona? This is called as a challenge test. Okay, induction of disease with the causative agent. So you expose people and then you see. Okay, if after you've given them the vaccine, but then you expose them, is it going to bring a difference or not? Okay, some previous interventions may be applied, follow-up may be very long. So for whatever reason, when you're not able to carry out an RCT, then non-randomized trials can be considered. So in non-randomized trials, you can have an uncontrolled trial. That means you don't have a comparison group. Okay. For example, Pap test for cervical smear, they've used historical controls. Okay. Then you can have natural experiments sometimes. Okay. Natural experiments are people naturally smoke. Some people smoke, some people don't smoke. So you can take that smoking as an experiment. Okay. That behavior smoking as an experiment. And you can look at the differences between those who smoke and don't smoke. Okay. Another natural experiment that happens is people move from place to place. And when people move from place to place, disease pattern can change. So you can do migrant studies. Okay, you can do experiments among religions. There are certain religions which they have circumcision, they have some practices, and some religions in which the women are covered with a burqa. Okay, so they have carried out their certain practices which are already there, and you can make use of that natural things which are happening. Sometimes in an earthquake, you have people, okay, because an earthquake is like a trauma. So you can have some people develop PTSD, some don't. Okay, so this is a natural experiment. So you will look at what was the trauma created by the earthquake and how many people did develop mental health problems. Okay, so that can act like a natural experiment. But you don't have a, this is a natural experiment that is occurring and you are not exposing the person to the intervention. Now there are some semi-experimental design. Semi-experimental design, they use less sophisticated form of analysis and they're usually based on difference in magnitude. So they just measure differences between group, okay? So some of the semi-experimental designs can be before and after designs. They can have sometimes you can do an after only control design. You can have a before and after with a control design, okay? So you have something, you have a level of phenomenon before the treatment, then you introduce the treatment, then you see what is the level. Okay, so your treatment effect will be y minus x. Okay, so this is a semi-experimental study, not very sophisticated. You're not calculating risk measures and all, you're just looking at treatment effects. Okay, so this is an after only with control design. And then you have a before and after with the control design. Okay, it's just that what your outcomes are, you're only looking at treatment effects, you're not getting risk measures. Now, because we are looking at randomized controlled trials, it's important for us to know that there are different phases of trials. And I'm sure if you have been reading or following the COVID vaccine trials, then you will know that a phase 1 trial is a small in-house study, usually looking for feasibility of the vaccine and the toxicity. And these are usually carried out in animal studies, okay? Then you have phase 2 trials, which are carried out. These are medium size. They're carried out usually in clinics. And the focus of this phase 2 trial is looking at what dose, how much dose, what is the lethal dose, okay, what is the efficacy and what's the control study. You will have comparison group. Then once you have sufficient data from these efficacy dosing studies, phase 2 studies, then you can carry out phase 3 larger studies. So your RCTs are large, okay, usually these phase 3 large, they're based in research institutions and you want to look at effectiveness and they are carried out in a randomized manner. Okay, so phase 3 studies are usually your RCTs. Once the vaccine has already come in, like come here, and then after you have given the vaccine to on a large scale, whatever you do post marketing surveillance, okay, acceptability, what are the adverse events, okay, because despite now you all know that the RCTs which were carried out, they were very short duration RCTs, okay, because every government and politician was desperate to have a vaccine, so the pharmaceutical companies have been working in overnight. So we've had fantastic breakthroughs, but we have not have sufficient time to see all the side effects. Okay, so in phase 4 trials, all of those will come out. Okay, acceptability, post marketing, adverse effects, because these are carried out in large population. So the same thing is what I have explained here in more detail. Okay, phase 1, phase 2, control trials, phase 3, expanded, okay, evaluate overall benefit risk relationship, and post marketing, okay, risk benefits and the optimal use of these trials. Okay, now ethical issues, very important. So Nuremberg Code is the most important document in the history of the ethics of medical research. This code was formulated more than 50 years ago. Nuremberg was where the court of justice was held, okay, and all the Nazi crimes, okay, what they did, all the experiments that they carried out in order to produce the blue-eyed blonde Aryan race, and all the experiments that they carried out on the Jewish population, okay, that was condemned. Okay, and so this Nuremberg is the blueprint for today's principles that ensure the rights of subjects in medical research. So it's a long thing, very important. I've just highlighted the important. So it's very important that you have voluntary consent of the human subject. Whatever experiments you do, you have to show that it is for good. Okay, and you had to have evidence from animal studies, and you should know something about the natural history of the disease. You have to conduct the experiment in such a way that you avoid unnecessarily physical and mental suffering. Okay, no experiment should be conducted where there is a reason to believe that you can have death or disabling injury. Okay, now if you don't have evidence enough that those who are trying to experiment, okay, even the experimenting physician should be part of the group. Okay, so many times you will find that scientists, especially in aging medicine and in research where they carry out and they're looking at DNA, many often they try out their experiments on themselves. Okay, because it is part of that requirement that if you're carrying out something for which you don't have sufficient data, the experimental physicians should also serve as subjects. The degree of risk should be never exceed, okay, whatever is the problem that can be solved by the experiment. Okay, you should have, very important, you should protect them against injury, disability, and death. It should only be conducted by scientifically qualified persons. Okay, you have to have highest degree of skill and care. And the human subject, whenever you enroll a person in a study, they should be told that they are free to leave the study at any point of time. Okay, so you should not force anyone to continue in your study. And also the scientist should be prepared to terminate the experiment at any stage. If you believe that continuing the experiment will harm your subjects, you have to be ready to terminate the stage. So in a nutshell, this is the Nuremberg Code. Okay, so very important concept is of beneficence. Okay, beneficence is a concept in research ethics which states that researchers should have the welfare of the research participant. It is not your drug or the trial or the vaccine which is important. Your first concern should be the welfare of the research participant, should be the goal of any clinical trial. And the opposite or the antonym of this is maleficence. Okay, so any practice which opposes the welfare of any research participant is maleficence. So the goal of all research is patient good. Okay, so if you believe your research is not going to do patient good, you have to stop your research. Okay, so that is the most important part that we have to remember whenever we carry out any experimental studies. Okay, so with that I conclude my study today. Thank you very much for your patient listening, and in my next class we will look at association and causation. Okay, how do we find out association between a certain exposure and a disease, and how we can say that they are related.